All of this has assumed that there would have been no Soviet intervention. That is not a given in this scenario, and it was not a given in 1973. The Egyptian and Syrian plan to attack Israel was only revealed to the Kremlin on October 4th, 1973. Although Brezhnev did little, if anything, to dissuade Sadat, he did gain agreement to evacuate Soviet civilians in advance of the war starting. The Soviet Mediterranean Fleet, known as the 5th Escadra, surged its forces to the Egyptian and Syrian coast to cover that evacuation. At this early stage, the squadron could muster 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 5 frigates. 11 submarines were also in support, about half of which were carrying anti-ship cruise missiles. Another destroyer and 4 more submarines entered the Mediterranean on the following day. Moscow began sending equipment and supplies to Syria and Egypt on the 9th of October. Some Egyptian sources deny that they ever received anything after the war began, but that doesn't tally with the Soviet records. Soviet and Warsaw Pact merchant ships and Soviet amphibious warfare vessels conducted the sea lift. They were accompanied by giant AN-22 transports, which were granted permission to fly over Turkey, a NATO member, in protest of US support for Israel. The Soviet Navy covered this effort as well, albeit they had only very limited ability to protect the air bridge. Armed Soviet Air Force flights into the Mediterranean were effectively blocked by Greece and Turkey, both NATO members. The nearest Soviet fighters to the Mediterranean were in Bulgaria. These bases were home to aging MiG-19 fighters, which lacked the range to reach far out to sea and the capabilities to challenge the Phantoms for air superiority. They would, however, have made an interesting fight with Greek F-102s and F-5s. As it happens, the Mediterranean was the first theatre in which the Soviets deployed any notable naval aviation assets. As a counter to Polaris submarine deployments in the early 1960s, they had commissioned the cruiser Moskva. Although unambiguously a helicopter carrier, the Soviets referred to it as a large anti-submarine cruiser in order to enable it to pass through the Bosphorus. The Moskva was, however, never intended to offset US naval air superiority. It carried 18 Ka-25 helicopters, which would have been easy pickings for US Navy fighters. Moskva was also a fairly dreadful carrier, with poor seakeeping and cramped conditions making it hard to operate from. Carrier-equipped or not, a 1973 naval clash in the Mediterranean between the US and Soviets may seem far-fetched. The Mediterranean was, after all, in effect a NATO lake. The US was able to use large bases at Rota in Spain, La Maddalena and Naples in Italy, and Suda Bay in Crete. The Soviets had no permanent bases, as leasing them would look too much like imperialism, the yoke of which the Soviets were supposed to be helping their Arab comrades throw off. Instead, the Soviet Navy relied on 12 pre-positioned floating docks, anchored in international waters. The main facilities were located off the Greek island of Kythera and in the Gulf of Sidra. Soviet ships had only very rudimentary underway replenishment capabilities, so they generally had to return to those docks to refuel and, if necessary, rearm. Lacking any shipyards, the only way the Soviets could reinforce was through the Dardanelles. This was not, however, an absolute barrier to their activities, as the Soviets were also able to exploit the tensions between Turkey, who controlled access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, and its NATO allies. The Soviet order of battle in October 1973 was therefore much stronger than you might expect. Even so, its commander, Admiral Yevgeny Volubiev, didn't expect to last long in the event of a full-scale war. US air superiority meant that a doctrine of first strike was of primary importance. The Soviets called this the Battle of the First Salvo. In 1973, Volubiev set out his thoughts on the subject of anti-carrier warfare in a briefing to his officers. He said ship attack groups need to use all weaponry for assaults on aerial attack groups: missiles, artillery, torpedoes, jet-powered rockets, the whole lot. Since it is unlikely anything will remain afloat after an airstrike, we are kamikazes. At this stage in the Cold War, Russian coordination between strike groups at sea was poor. Their ability to coordinate with long-range aviation assets or with submarines was close to zero. Mid-course guidance of anti-ship missiles was essential at the time, as these platforms would just launch their missiles into a box in which they hoped the carrier could be found. A close tail was therefore required. So as the sea and air bridges began, the Kinder-class cruiser Grozny and the Kashin-class destroyers Krasny Kavkaz, Porovny, and Skrony began to trail the Independence. Murmansk, a Sverdlov-class cruiser, and a destroyer followed the Roosevelt. A pair of Echo-class SSGNs, a Julia SSG, and a November SSN were also in the area around Crete. The signal was clear. If the US tried to interfere with the resupply effort, then the Soviets would meet the attempt with force. The US Navy, for its part, was increasingly frustrated with the restrictions placed on it from Washington. More escorts were dispatched from 6th Fleet to cover the carriers, but the signal the White House wanted to send was to Egypt and Syria, so they kept the carriers in a small area around Crete that made them predictable and easy for the Soviets to cover. The Sverdlov-class cruiser Admiral Ushkov and 2 more anti-aircraft destroyers arrived at Crete on the 10th. It started to trail the Guadalcanal as well. Things escalated further on the 11th when the Israeli Navy's missile boats attacked the harbour at Tartus. The Soviet merchant ship Ilya Mechnikov was moored there, having been one of the last ships to bring supplies to Syria when the war started. It was hit and sank within the harbour limits. The Soviets refused to accept Israel's apology for this and moved 2 destroyers close to the Syrian coast. The US responded by ordering the John F. Kennedy battle group to leave Scotland and transit into the Mediterranean. Then, on the 16th, several Soviet minor combatants, a minesweeper and a landing ship, fired at Israeli jets to drive them off. The situation was very tense and developing at a more rapid pace at sea than the commanders-in-chief in Moscow and Washington could respond to. On one side, the Soviets were wary of Israeli attacks on their ships, but also wanted to avoid accidentally engaging a US aircraft. On the other side, the US Navy needed to keep its carriers safe, but restricted in operational area and now stripped of escorts, this was an increasingly challenging task. Independence was now accompanied only by the 6th Fleet's flagship, Little Rock, the powerful SAM-equipped destroyer Belknap, and 2 destroyers with SAMs, the Kuntz and the Samson. Roosevelt's escort was based around the small Lee-class cruiser Harry E. Yarnell and 3 destroyers. The chances of a misunderstanding were significant. The US protested that Soviet ships had their missile launchers loaded and pointed at the US carriers. The Soviets agreed to stop doing this, but US destroyers shadowing the Soviet ships were given orders to shoot at the missile launchers if it looked like they were preparing to fire. But things really got worse on the 24th. By this stage, it was obvious that the Israelis had won. A second ceasefire had failed to hold. Port Said and Cairo itself were now at risk. At Sadat's pleading, Brezhnev sent a message to Nixon. He told the president that Israel was violating the UN resolution governing the ceasefire. He proposed a joint US and Soviet peacekeeping force to man the ceasefire lines. If Nixon rejected the proposal, then the Soviet Union would consider acting unilaterally. On the day that the note was received, a powerful Soviet naval force headed towards Port Said, centered around their cruiser Admiral Ushakov. It escorted 3 landing ships full of Soviet Marines. The CIA briefed Nixon that it believed that one of the Soviet ships heading to Egypt was carrying nuclear weapons that could be employed on the EAF's Sioux fitters. 7 divisions of Soviet airborne troops were also placed on alert. The practicalities of delivering those 50,000 soldiers to the region aren't clear, but the threat was there. The AN-22 transports suspended their flights in preparation for an order to transport them. US forces moved to DEFCON 3, Roundhouse. The tactical commanders were now in a very challenging situation. Both sides knew that they had to strike first to prevent taking severe damage. At DEFCON 3, the US Admiral's objective was to successfully launch 6 nuclear armed intruders from the FDR and 8 from the Independence at 15 minutes' notice. Oddly, the vigilantes on Independence don't appear to have been tasked with nuclear strike in this instance, despite that being their only attack role. Their targets remain classified, but testimony from flight crews on the ships make it clear that nuclear delivery was the primary mission. Once that was done, they then needed to survive the inevitable Soviet attack. Striking first if war was inevitable was obviously preferable. Independence had Little Rock and Belknap in close attendance. The former, a Galveston-class guided missile cruiser, had once been a gun-armed light cruiser and retained one triple 6-inch gun turret. Its long-range Talos SAMs could also be used in a surface-to-surface capacity. Little Rock was thus the most powerful surface warship on either side. Trailing Independence, the Soviet cruiser Grozny had 8 SSN-3 Shadok launchers, massive 5-ton carrier-killing missiles carrying a 1-ton warhead, or, ominously, a 300-kiloton nuclear warhead. The weapons were carried in 2 quadruple launchers fore and aft. To fire them, the ship needed to turn broadside so that the exhaust would be vented over the side. Given the close proximity of the two sides, the US would therefore have had some warning of a launch. The missiles were radar directed, so emissions would have given the Soviets away. My understanding of Soviet tactical doctrine is that if the intention was to strike, Grozny and one of the destroyers would have stood off 15 or 20 miles, leaving the other destroyer in close to provide mid-course guidance. Their intention was to reduce the ability of the carrier's escorts to respond by being able to launch without radiating. Logically, the US response to this would have been to run away as fast as possible. Independence was at least 5 knots faster than Grozny, and possibly as much as 10 knots. If the Soviets managed to get off a salvo, then the Talos and smaller Terrier missiles on the US escorts may have been able to bring them down, but reaction time was very limited. The Shadok, as I said, was a big unit. It was 10 meters long and had a 5-meter wingspan, not that much smaller than a MiG-15. It was subsonic and it flew a straight course. Both Terrier and Talos had demonstrated an ability to hit such targets in Vietnam by downing a MiG-17 and 4 MiG-21s respectively. These, however, weren't Aegis systems. I believe I'm correct in saying that each ship only had one SAM director, so although they could launch multiple missiles, they could only engage one target at a time. If Grozny was 15 miles away, then flight time was about a minute and a half. There was, therefore, time to launch 3 or maybe 4 salvos of 2 Terriers, and probably 2 salvos of Talos in that time. Assuming that a cap was already aloft, it is not inconceivable that Phantoms could have chased down cruise missiles fired towards the carriers. An Israeli Mirage 3 shot down a Kelt missile on the first day of the war using a Shafir 2. The size of the Shadoks suggests that the F-4s would have been able to use Sidewinders or the Big White Wingman for the same purpose. ECM and chaff had proved effective against the less powerful sticks in engagements earlier in the Yom Kippur War, and would have also been part of the Navy's defensive strategy. In the reports that have come out in the last 20 years, there's a sense that the Soviet missiles would have doomed the US carriers. But as I stack up the defensive systems with the relatively small number of quite crude missiles being launched, I'm not so sure that's what would have happened. It's hard to make a case for any missiles reaching their targets. FDR's tale was centered around Murmansk, which was an old-school 6-inch gun cruiser. Warning would have been limited if that ship decided to engage, however there would have been some delay to correct the aim of the guns. Lee only had 2 3-inch guns, so it would have been dependent on the US destroyers to fight off the big cruiser until FDR could get out of range, launch aircraft, or both. The threat to FDR was arguably worse than that to Independence. The carrier commanders therefore needed to figure out how to launch their nuclear strikes, clear the deck, and get off some anti-ship sorties. Those would either carry dumb bombs or potentially laser-guided paveways. The US wouldn't deploy air-launched anti-ship missiles on the intruder until the early 1980s. All of the Soviet ships carried SAM systems, although whether they would have had the wherewithal to use them effectively given everything else that was going on is hard to assess. Even so, despite this being an aviation channel, it's hard to escape the conclusion that the first minutes of a conflict between US carriers and the Soviet Navy in the Eastern Mediterranean in October 1973 would have been determined by the carriers' escorts. You can see why the option to launch a first strike may have been taken if the fleet commanders felt the slightest inkling of a threat. If they survived those first minutes, then the US carriers would have gone on the offensive to hunt down the other surface formations at large in the Mediterranean. That's how full-scale wars start. Fortunately, in this case, both sides backed down. Brezhnev and Nixon agreed that a UN force without US or Soviet representation would police the ceasefire. After a few weeks, both sides began to draw down their forces. So these scenarios remain simply interesting thought experiments.